Hi guys, and welcome to Boring History Relaxing. Tonight we ease ourselves down into the earth, not in a dramatic movie scene we're seeing, but the slow, practical way people once did when winter decided to stay far too long. You feel the cold first in your boots, then in your knees, then in that quiet place behind your ribs where heat usually hides. The wind above ground keeps pushing, scraping across the plains, searching for gaps. Down here the sound fades. The soil closes around you like a heavy blanket that smells faintly of clay and old roots. It is not glamorous. It is not brave. It is simply necessary. And yes, just to set expectations early, you probably would not survive this without preparation. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights and stay where you are. You're already halfway underground and winter has only just begun. You lower yourself the rest of the way down shoulders, brushing packed earth boots, finding a floor that feels firm but not quite dry. The cold above ground does not vanish, but it loses its sharpness. It becomes dull, more patient. That is the first lesson. Cold underground does not attack. It waits. You can almost feel the prairie pressing down from above, not threatening, just present like a weight you have agreed to carry in exchange for survival. People on the American frontier did not romanticize this choice. A mainstream historical fact often mentioned in settler accounts is that dugouts and sod houses were common across the Great Plains from the mid-19th century onward. Especially where timber was scarce and winter winds were relentless. You were not hiding. You were insulating. Earth was free, abundant, and far more reliable than a thin plank wall when temperatures plunged well below freezing. You stand still for a moment, letting your eyes adjust. Light enters from a single opening. Maybe a door, maybe just a covered hole angled toward the south. It is enough. Down here, enough is the goal. Too much space means too much air to heat. Too much light means heat escaping. Comfort is not spaciousness. Comfort is control. You scrape frost from your gloves and hang them near the wall, knowing they will not dry completely. They never do. Moisture is always present below ground, clinging to the air, darkening the soil. Some settlers learned to live with this dampness. Others never quite did. Historians still argue whether underground living caused more health problems than above-ground cabins, or whether poor ventilation was simply a universal frontier issue, regardless of housing type. What is clear is that people noticed the trade-off immediately. Less wind meant more stillness. More stillness meant moisture lingered. You kneel and touch the wall. It feels cool, not icy. That matters. Wood can freeze at enough to steal heat on contact, as earth resists that. It holds yesterday's warmth and releases it slowly, almost politely. That steady temperature is why underground sleeping worked at all. The ground stays close to the yearly average temperature, warmer than winter air, cooler than summer heat. You're borrowing that stability tonight. There is a smell down here that you do not quite notice at first. Soil, yes, but also smoke that has soaked into everything. Even if you do not have a stove burning, yet the scent lingers from past nights. It mixes with wool leather breath. A quirky tidbit recorded in a few pioneer diaries mentions that newcomers sometimes complained their dugouts smelled like wet cellars, while long-time residents claim they could not smell anything at all. Your nose adapts faster than your fingers. You spread bedding close to the floor. This feels backward if you are used to raised beds, but heat rises. The warmest air will gather just above where you lie. Frontier families learned this through experience, not theory. Children often slept directly on pallets of straw and blankets close to the packed earth, while adults took slightly higher positions if space allowed. Nobody was picky. The night settles in without ceremony. There is no dramatic moment where darkness arrives. It simply deepens. Above you, the wind continues its endless work, but here it becomes a distant pressure rather than a sound. The earth absorbs the noise the way it absorbs cold. You realize how much of your anxiety about winter has always been tied to sound, Whistling cracks, rattling boards, howling gusts, underground winter goes quiet. This quiet can be unsettling at first. Sound is information. Silence feels like uncertainty. You hold still and listen anyway. Your own breathing sounds louder. Someone shifts nearby. A stove pops softly as metal contracts. These small noises replace the storm outside. They tell you that life is still moving. You pull a blanket tighter, not because you're freezing, but because you know the temperature will drop more before morning. That knowledge is another learned behavior. People on the frontier slept with anticipation. You prepare for cold before it arrives. That mindset becomes automatic. As you lie there, you think about the choice that led you underground. It was not fear, it was arithmetic. How much fuel do you have? How much food remains? How long until spring? A sod wall does not burn. Earth does not need chopping. That efficiency mattered more than appearances. Modern images often show frontier life as rugged cabins against endless snow, but many settlers quietly preferred the invisibility of earth-covered homes. You could walk past one and never know it was there. Your eyes finally adjust enough to pick out shapes. The ceiling is low. You can reach up and touch it if you want, though you do not. Touching the ceiling reminds you of weight. Tonight you are content to let it exist without comment. Sleep does not arrive quickly. It never does on the first night. You're aware of your body in space, aware of the earth holding steady around you. This awareness is not panic. It is orientation. Underground sleeping requires trust, and trust takes time. You remind yourself that people did this for decades through winters far worse than this one. The cold presses from all sides above ground. Down here it presses more gently filtered, slowed. You're not warm exactly, but you're not being stripped of heat either. That difference is everything. You close your eyes and let the earth do what it has always done quietly without drama. You wake without fully surfacing from sleep the way people do when the cold shifts rather than strikes. Something has changed. Not dramatically. The air feels heavier, more settled. The earth has cooled a little more during the night, releasing what warmth it could spare. You breathe slowly, testing the space before you move. This is another habit learned quickly underground. Sudden motion wastes heat. Above you, wind is still doing whatever it does best, but you only sense it as a pressure, like weather remembered rather than heard. Choosing dirt over wind begins to make more sense now, not as an idea, but as a physical fact. Timber complains when the temperature drops. It creaks, shrinks, and announces every gust. Earth stays quiet. It absorbs effort instead of resisting it. You shift your legs, careful not to kick the wall. The floor feels firm but forgiving. Packed soil gives slightly underweight, then holds. This balance matters. A floor too hard steals warmth. A floor too soft turns damp and miserable. Settlers learned how tightly to pack earth by trial, error, and cold feet. A mainstream historical fact found in homestead records is that many dugouts and sod houses included a clay-rich floor intentionally chosen for its density and insulation, even when better-looking soil was available nearby. You sit up slowly. The ceiling is close enough that you automatically hunch even if you do not need to. That posture stays with people long after they leave underground shelters. You see it in old photographs, shoulders slightly rounded, heads tilted forward. It is not weakness, it is adaptation. You reach for a layer you kept close through the night. Clothing is never far. Sleeping underground does not mean sleeping undressed. Even children slept in partial day clothes during winter, ready to move if something went wrong. Fire went out. Snow collapsed a doorway. A stovepipe clogged. You are always half awake to these possibilities. You add another log to the stove, coaxing embers back into a low glow. You do not want flame. Flame eats oxygen and demands attention. You want heat that lingers. The metal ticks softly as it warms. That sound becomes familiar, almost comforting. Some diaries describe settlers judging the health of their stove by its sounds at night, knowing which pops were normal and which meant trouble. A quirky tidbit from one Nebraska homestead account mentions a family naming their stove. after a stubborn mule because it needed constant convincing to cooperate. You settle back down close to the stove now. Heat spreads slowly. This is not the blast of a fireplace. It is a gradual reclaiming of space. The air nearest the stove warms first, then inches outward. Underground patience is part of warmth. Rushing only makes you colder. Choosing dirt over wind also meant choosing darkness over view. There is no window to look out at snowdrifts or stars. Light arrives filtered cautious. This changes your sense of time. Morning is not announced by brightness, but by subtle temperature shifts and the need to tend fire. Some people liked this. Others found it unsettling. Historians still argue whether underground living increased feelings of isolation among settlers, or whether the constant demands of frontier life left little room for introspection either way. What is certain is that time felt different when the sun could not easily intrude. You think about cabins now standing exposed on open land boards rattling all night. Cabins looked like success. Dugouts looked temporary. Yet many families chose underground homes first and never bothered to upgrade. Once a sod roof was properly laid and grass took hold, insulation improved even more. Snow piled on top acted like another blanket. From inside you barely noticed it. Storms though for me. Dusselberry wagons above ground. You pull your blanket tighter and notice how little air moves. This stillness is a gift and a risk. Without drafts, warmth stays put. Without drafts, smoke and breath linger. You crack a small vent just enough to feel a faint exchange. Cold creeps in immediately, reminding you why this opening stays small. Balancing air and warmth is a nightly calculation. You listen again. No wind howl, no snapping wood, just breathing fire, the faint settling of earth. The ground does shift sometimes, especially during freeze and thaw cycles. That thought crosses your mind and passes. People worried about collapse more often when rain followed snow, but winter itself usually kept things stable. Frozen ground held firm. Ironically, spring caused more damage than cold ever did. Your body relaxes further now. The choice you made feels right. Not heroic, just sensible. Wind cannot steal what it cannot reach. Earth stands between you and the worst of winter, absorbing its anger and offering steadiness in return. You close your eyes again, letting sleep come back in fragments. Underground, sleep is lighter, more alert. You drift, wake, drift again. Each time you reorient, reassured by the same muted quiet. This repetition builds trust. By the third or fourth night, your body will stop questioning the ceiling. It will accept the earth as shelter rather than threat. For now you lie still, wrapped in layers, listening to the stove breathe softly beside you. Above, winter wastes its energy on empty air. Below, you conserve yours. By the time you commit to digging, daylight has already begun to feel precious. Winter does that. It shrinks margins. You measure time not by clocks, but by how far the sun clears the horizon before giving up. Digging before darkness is not ambition. It is necessity pressing gently but firmly on your back. You step outside, briefly bracing against the cold just long enough to remind yourself why this work matters. Wind moves freely here, finding every seam in your clothing. Snow squeaks underfoot, that dry sound that only happens when temperatures have dropped well below comfortable. You do not linger. You go back to the cut in the earth, to the place where ground has already been broken, where effort from previous days waits patiently for continuation. The soil resists at first. Frozen crust fights the shovel, forcing you to chip rather than scoop. This is slow work, loud work. Each strike rings through your arms. Once you break through the top layer, the earth softens. It yields grudgingly, but it yields. That transition matters. Settlers learned quickly that timing mattered more than strength. Dig too early in winter and the ground collapses. Dig too late and it turns to stone. A mainstream historical fact found in plain settlement guides was the advice to begin earth shelters in late autumn, when soil was firm but not yet fully frozen. You work in short bursts, dig, rest, breathe, dig again. Sweat forms despite the cold and you manage it carefully. Sweat is dangerous now. Damp clothing steals heat faster than any wind. You open your coat just enough to vent, then close it again. These small adjustments become second nature. Frontier survival is built from thousands of these moments, each one unremarkable on its own. As the hole deepens, sound changes. Shovel strikes become duller. The earth absorbs noise. You notice this before you consciously think about it. The work feels quieter even though your effort has not changed. This quiet is one reason people preferred below-ground shelters. The land itself participates, taking on some of the burden. You pause to rest and look at the walls you have cut. They are rough-layered, each band of soil, telling a different story. Clay, loam, sand. Some layers crumble easily, others hold their shape. You learn which to trust. A quirky tidbit mentioned in a Dakota Territory letter describes a settler who claimed he could predict winter severity by how stubborn certain soil layers felt under his shovel. There is no science behind it, but people believed what their bodies told them. You carve shelves into the walls as you go, not decorative shelves, functional ones, places to set tools, candles, bits of food. These decisions happen naturally. You're shaping space to suit your movements. Dugouts were often asymmetrical for this reason. Perfect lines waste energy. Useful ones conserve it. Darkness creeps closer, though you feel it more than see it. Light above ground fades first, but below shadows thicken in place. You light a candle or lantern, careful to shield the flame. Fire behaves differently underground. It feels brighter, more intrusive. You respect it. You keep working, knowing you must stop before fatigue makes mistakes likely. Collapses happen when people rush. Earth shelters demand patience. Historians still argue whether most dugout accidents were caused by poor construction or by settlers pushing beyond safe limits due to time pressure. What is agreed upon is that caution saved lives more often than speed. When you finally stop, your arms ache in that deep, satisfying way that signals honest labour. You climb out slowly, brushing soil from your clothes. The hole waits behind you, dark and unfinished but promising. You mark it mentally, noting what remains to be done. This is not a project completed in a single day. It is a negotiation stretched over many. You eat quickly, standing, if possible. Sitting too long outside drains warmth. The sky has turned the colour of iron. Night will be sharp. You return underground as soon as you can, carrying tools and the smell of fresh soil with you. Inside, the space feels different now. Larger, more intentional. The air still carries cold, but it feels contained. You arrange what you have, pushing dirt into corners, tamping down loose areas with the flat of your shovel. Packing earth is an art learned through feet rather than eyes. You stomp gently, listening for hollow sounds, adjusting pressure, until the ground answers with a solid thud. You lie down again, muscles heavy. Fatigue warms you briefly, then fades, leaving a deeper chill. This is expected. Work heats you only temporarily. Shelter must do the rest. You pull blankets close and breathe through your nose, slow and steady. As sleep approaches, you replay the day in small pieces, the sound of the shovel breaking frost, the smell of disturbed earth, the way light behaved as the hole deepened. These details anchor you. Tomorrow you will dig again, refining, strengthening. Each pass makes the space safer, warmer, more familiar. Above you, winter settles in fully now. Snow begins to fall, soft at first, then heavier. You do not hear it. You only feel the earth accept it layer by layer, adding weight and insulation. The work you did before darkness matters now. It allows you to rest while the storm builds. You close your eyes, hands still faintly tingling from effort. Digging before darkness was not just about finishing a task. It was about earning this moment of stillness, this quiet pause beneath a world growing colder. The first night underground never really ends. It loosens its grip, slowly releasing you in stages rather than all at once. You drift in and out of sleep, each return carrying a slightly different awareness. At one point you wake convinced something has shifted, only to realize it is your own breathing, echoing differently than it does above ground. Sound behaves oddly here. It does not travel far, but it lingers. You turn carefully, testing the space with small movements. Your shoulder brushes the wall, cool but not biting. That detail matters more than you expected. Cold that burns wakes panic. Cold that waits can be negotiated with blankets and patience. You pull fabric closer to your neck and settle again. At some point, the stove sighs a soft metallic sound as heat fades and returns. You do not open your eyes. You've already learned that underground nights are managed as much by listening as by seeing. People who slept this way train themselves to read temperature by subtle cues. The weight of air on skin, the sharpness of inhaled breath, the way the floor steals warmth if you let a foot wander too far. Period settlement guides often noted that first nights in dugouts were the most restless, not because they were colder, but because they felt unfamiliar. Once routine took over, people slept more deeply below ground than they ever had in cabins. The earth did not creak. Roofs did not groan. There were fewer surprises. You wake again, this time more fully. Darkness remains complete. You cannot tell if hours or minutes have passed. That uncertainty used to unsettle newcomers. With time, it became liberating. Without visual cues, the body stopped anticipating morning too early. Rest happened when it was needed, not when light demanded it. You adjust the blanket beneath you, noticing how bedding has already flattened. Straw compresses quickly under weight, losing loft. Settlers compensated by layering refreshing bedding often, and accepting that comfort was temporary by nature. One account from the Kansas plains mentions a woman replacing straw bedding every few weeks during winter, despite the labour, because flattened straw pulled heat away faster than bare earth. It was an exhausting but necessary ritual. You listen again. No wind, no snapping frost, just the soft internal noises of life continuing. Someone nearby coughs quietly, then resettles. The sound does not travel far. Underground spaces keep privacy in odd ways. Even crowded shelters could feel intimate rather than noisy. Sleep returns in fragments, short stretches of drifting, then awareness. Then drifting again. You stop fighting it. This pattern becomes normal. Long winter nights stretch endlessly above ground. Below they fold inward, broken into manageable pieces. At one point you dream of open space, sky, wind. You wake with a start, heart racing briefly before you remember where you are. The ceiling presses close, reassuring in its own way. Earth has weight. Weight means protection. That logic settles you faster than reason ever could. Accounts from the late 19th century suggest that children adapted to underground sleeping faster than adults. They accepted the closeness, the darkness, the altered rhythms without resistance. Grown-ups brought expectations with them. Children simply adjusted. Some later observers questioned whether this adaptability came from resilience or necessity, and there is still no clear consensus. What is clear is that people of all ages learned new sleep patterns when survival required it. You wake again, and this time there is a difference. Not light exactly, but a softening of blackness. The entrance admits a faint grey tone. Morning exists somewhere above you. It is distant and unimportant for now. You sit up slowly. The air feels colder again. Fires die lowest just before dawn. This is when underground shelters feel least forgiving. You move with purpose now, not rushing, but deliberate. You add fuel, coaxing heat back into the space. The stove responds reluctantly, like a body warming stiff joints. Condensation beads faintly along the wall near the ceiling. Moisture always finds the coldest surface. You wipe it away with a cloth, a habit learned quickly. Left alone it freezes, then melts, then soaks bedding. This small maintenance task repeats endlessly through winter. Nothing dramatic, just attention. Some later historians have suggested that managing moisture was one of the defining skills of underground living, more important than fire tending or insulation. Others downplay its impact, arguing that all frontier homes struggle with dampness. What everyone agrees on is that ignoring it led to misery. You stretch carefully, joints stiff from the cold and confined space. Movement sends a small wave of warmth through your body. You welcome it, then conserve it. Breakfast can wait. Heat comes first. As these space warm smells reassert themselves, earth, smoke, wool, a faint sourness from damp leather. None of it is pleasant exactly, but it is familiar. Familiarity counts as comfort out here. You glance toward the entrance again. Lights and strengthen slightly. Morning will arrive whether you are ready or not. But underground, you greet it on your own terms. You're not dragged awake by cold wind or blinding glare. You emerge slowly, carrying warmth with you, rather than losing it instantly. The first night below ground has done its work. It has taught you what needs attention and what can be ignored. It has shown you that safety does not always look like openness. Sometimes it looks like stillness and weight and walls close enough to touch. You take a breath and settle back briefly, letting the stove finish its work. Above you, winter continues. Down here, you've learned how to sleep inside it rather than against it. You feel the warmth before you consciously recognize it, the way the body notices relief before the mind catches up. It is not heat in the dramatic sense. Nothing glows. Nothing roars. The warmth comes slowly, as if the ground is deciding how much it can afford to give you. Earth does not overextend itself. You lie still and let it happen. Underground stillness is part of the exchange. Movement stirs cold air. Rest allows warmth to gather. You sense it collecting around your legs first, then your hips, then your back. The ceiling remains cool, holding on to last night's chill. That contrast is expected. Heat settles low. That is why you arranged yourself this way. Settlers learned early that Earth behaves like a massive thermal battery. Soil absorbs warmth during the day and releases it gradually when temperatures drop. Modern science explains this with numbers and graphs, but people on the frontier understood it through sore joints and frozen fingers. They noticed that underground spaces rarely match the brutal extremes felt outside. Even during severe cold snaps, temperatures below ground change slowly. This principle guided everything from shelter design to where people place their beds. You adjust a blanket and feel the floor beneath you. It no longer bites. That tells you the shelter is doing its job. A packed earth floor, properly insulated with straw hides or even old newspapers when available, prevented direct heat loss. Some settlers layered buffalo robes or animal skins under bedding, not for softness, but because dense hides blocked cold transfer better than woven cloth. There is a pause in your breathing as you settle deeper into warmth. This pause marks trust. You are no longer bracing. Your body believes it will not be punished for relaxing. That belief takes time to form and disappears quickly if broken. One truly cold night can undo days of adaptation. You reach out and touch the wall again, more out of curiosity than necessity. It feels faintly warmer than before. Not much, just enough to notice. That warmth does not come from fire. It comes from yesterday, from the heat your body released from the stove's low burn, from the snow above acting as insulation rather than threat. Earth remembers. Some early land agents and surveyors remarked with surprise that sod houses often stayed warmer than wooden cabins during winter nights despite their crude appearance. This observation challenged assumptions brought from the eastern states, where wood was plentiful and earth shelters were rare. Over time, practicality replaced pride. People chose what worked. You listen to the space as it settles. Warm air expands, slightly shifting pressure. The stove ticks once, then goes quiet. These sounds become familiar markers. They tell you when to adjust, when to leave things alone. Heat underground does not need constant feeding. That is one of its greatest advantages. You do not spend the night waking every hour to stoke flames. You allow warmth to do what it does best, linger. This conservation mattered in winters when fuel was scarce or hard won. Every log save meant one less dangerous trip into the cold. There are stories of settlers timing their sleep cycles to the thermal rhythm of their shelter. They would rest deeply during the warmest part of the night and wake briefly during the coldest stretch to add fuel if needed. Over time, bodies learned this pattern without conscious effort. Sleep adapted to architecture. A handful of frontier letters mention people pressing jars of water into the floor near the stove, letting the earth keep them from freezing overnight. In the morning, the water would be cold but liquid proof that the ground's temperature held steady. It was a simple test repeated often and trusted more than thermometers when those were available at all. Researchers examining these practices later debated how much heat actually came from the earth itself versus heat trapped by the insulation and snow cover. There is no single answer. The experience varied with soil type, depth, and construction. What mattered to the people living it was the outcome. They stayed alive. They slept. You turn onto your side, careful not to disturb the pocket of warmth you have built. This too becomes habit. Underground sleepers move less. They guard heat the way one might guard a flame from wind. As minutes pass, the chill at the edges of the space softens. You could almost imagine yourself comfortable. Not cozy in the modern sense, but steady. Safe. That distinction matters. Comfort implies luxury, steadiness implies survival. Your breathing slows further. Thoughts stretch out and thin. The earth continues its quiet work, holding, releasing, balancing. There is no drama in this process, and that is its strength. Fire can fail suddenly. Walls can crack. Earth rarely surprises you when treated with respect. Above ground, winter sharpens its edges as night deepens. Below you rest in borrowed warmth, wrapped not just in blankets, but in the accumulated patience of soil that has endured far worse than this. Sleep finds you again, heavier this time. The kind of sleep that does not ask permission. The ground holds heat. The ground holds you. And for now that is enough. The smell reaches you before you fully wake. Not unpleasant exactly, but unmistakable. Damp earth carries its own signature, a mix of clay mineral and something faintly organic. It settles into the air and clings there, especially overnight when warmth rises and meets cooler walls. You breathe it in without reacting. That too is learned. Moisture is always present below ground. It announces itself quietly. Walls darkens on slightly. Fabric feels heavier by morning. Leather loses its crispness. None of this signals failure. It signals environment. Frontier shelters were not sealed systems. They breathed slowly, exchanging air through cracks, vents, and doors open just enough to keep smoke from lingering too long. You sit up and notice tiny beads of water along the upper wall, where yesterday's warmth has met last night's cold. You wipe them away with a cloth kept nearby for this exact purpose. This small act repeats daily. People who slept underground quickly learned that ignoring moisture led to misery far faster than ignoring cold. Wet bedding stole heat. Wet clothing invited illness. Several period manuals for homesteaders advised digging shelters into well-drained slopes whenever possible, favouring sandy or loamy soils over heavy clay. The advice was not aesthetic, it was practical. Water that drained away meant walls that stayed drier, floors that stayed firm. In regions where clay dominated, people adapted by raising sleeping platforms slightly or adding thicker layers beneath bedding. You sniff the air again, gauging whether it feels stale. Smoke has a way of lingering overnight, especially if the stove burned low and vents were closed too tightly. You crack the entrance briefly, letting in a blade of cold air. It cuts through the space, immediately sharp and unwelcome, but it does its job. Freshness returns. You close the opening again and pull your blanket tight. Some settlers grew so accustomed to the underground smell that above-ground air later felt thin or exposed to them. One recollection from an Iowa family describes returning to a wooden house after years in a sod dwelling and finding the air uncomfortably dry and drafty. Comfort recalibrates itself without asking permission. Managing dampness became a skill passed quietly between neighbours. There was no single solution. Some swore by lining walls with newspaper when available. Others hung spare blankets to absorb moisture overnight, drying them near the stove by day. A few even sprinkled wood ash along the base of walls, believing it helped draw moisture away. Whether it truly worked or not, the practice persisted. Scholars examining these habits later questioned how effective such methods were compared to simple ventilation, but they also noted that belief played a role. Feeling in control mattered. When winter stripped away so many options, even small acts of maintenance offered reassurance. You run a hand along the floor, checking for soft spots. Packed earth should resist your palm. Too much give means water is seeping in. Today the floor holds. That tells you the shelter is coping well. Snow outside may melt and refreeze, but for now the ground beneath you remains stable. The smell shifts slightly as the stove warms. Smoke mingles with soil, creating a scent that becomes the background of winter memory. Years later, people would recall it instantly. Not fondly, not bitterly, but clearly. It marked a season of endurance. You lie back down, repositioning yourself to avoid contact with the wall. Direct contact invites chill and dampness. This awareness becomes instinctive. You no longer think about where warmth pools or where moisture collects. Your body knows. There are nights when rain follows snow and the smell grows stronger and walls darken more quickly. Those nights demand extra attention. But winter with its frozen ground often proved kinder than shoulder seasons. Frozen soil locked moisture into place. Ironically, the cold that threatened life also stabilized the shelter. You breathe slowly, letting the scent fade into the background. It does not vanish. It becomes familiar enough to ignore. Underground life is full of these adjustments. You do not conquer discomfort. You absorb it, fold it into routine and move on. Some later observers claim that dampness underground must have been unbearable. Diaries tell a more measured story. People complained, yes, but they stayed. They adapted. They preferred predictable discomfort over exposure to wind that never rested. As the space warms again, moisture recedes slightly. The walls lighten. The air feels less heavy. This rhythm repeats daily, a quiet negotiation between heat and cold dryness and damp. You learn to read it the way sailors read tides. You close your eyes, breathing through your nose, filtering the air slowly. The smell no longer signals danger. It signals shelter doing its imperfect job. The earth holds you, moisture and all, and you accept the trade without complaint. You notice the floor long before you think about the bed. That is the quiet truth of underground sleeping. The ground dictates everything. It decides where warmth gathers, where cold lingers, where comfort is even possible. Beds come later. First you understand the floor. You shift your weight and feel how the earth responds. It gives just enough to acknowledge you, then settles back into itself. Packed soil is not soft, but it is forgiving in a way wood never is. A wooden floor snaps cold straight into bone. Earth slows the exchange. That difference is why bedding stays low here, closer to where heat pools, instead of floating away. You spread layers carefully. Straw first pressed flat with your hands, then hides, then blankets. Each layer has a purpose, Bo. Straw traps air but collapses quickly. Hides block cold transfer. Wool holds warmth even when damp. None of this is accidental. These choices come from nights spent shivering through mistakes. Frontier household rarely used raised bed frames underground. Practical descriptions from the plains note that most families slept on pallets laid directly on the floor, sometimes lifted only a few inches on boards or packed sod. The goal was not elevation, but insulation. Being closer to the ground meant staying within the warmest layer of air. You lie down and feel the difference immediately. The cold does not rush in. It presses slowly, testing edges rather than attacking. Your back warms first, then your shoulders. You adjust once, twice, then stop moving. Movement disrupts the fragile balance you have built. Some settlers believed sleeping too close to the floor caused illness. Others dismissed that fear entirely, pointing out that raised beds in drafty cabins left people colder, not healthier. Later examinations of frontier health records offer no simple answer. Sickness came from many sources: cold crowding, poor nutrition. The floor alone was not the villain some imagined. You tuck extra fabric around your feet. Feet lose heat fastest. People learned this without instruction. Children slept curled instinctively, drawing knees up, conserving warmth within their cores. Adults followed suit. Underground sleeping reshaped posture as much as it reshaped habits. A small telling detail appears in several winter accounts from sod houses. People place spare clothing beneath their heads instead of pillows, not for comfort, but to keep garments warm and flexible by morning. Frozen clothes crack and resist movement. Warm ones cooperate. Even sleep became part of preparation for the day ahead. You listen as the space settles. The floor absorbs sound, two dulling shifts and steps. This makes nights quieter, but it also hides movement. You become sensitive to vibrations instead. A subtle tremor might mean someone turning nearby. A heavier one might signal something outside. You learn the difference. Your body relaxes further as heat gathers low. The ceiling stays cool, holding last night's chill. This vertical contrast defines underground life. Warmth belongs near the ground. Cold lingers above. Everything about how you arrange yourself reflects that reality. Some later writers romanticized underground sleeping as cozy, almost womb-like. Period descriptions are more restrained. People appreciated the warmth, but they remained aware of the limits. Too much heat meant dampness. Too little meant misery. Balance required attention every night. You close your eyes and breathe slowly. The smell of earth and fabric blends into something neutral. The floor beneath you no longer feels cold, it feels present, reliable. That reliability is the real luxury here. There are moments when you miss the idea of a bed, springs, height, separation from dirt, but those are ideas imported from somewhere else. Out here, practicality rewrites preference. You sleep where heat stays. You shift once more, then stop. Your body has found its place, the floor holds steady. The air near you warms. Above, winter presses on without pause. Below you lie close to the earth, letting it do the quiet work it has always done, slowly giving back what it took during the day. Sleep comes heavier now, deeper, the kind that does not ask for softness or space, just steadiness. Just enough warmth. The floor provides and that is why you stay close to it. You notice the change in sound before you identify its source. It's not louder or softer, just altered, as if the night has been wrapped in fabric. Noise does not travel straight lines underground. It bends, it dulls, it settles close to where it begins and rarely wanders far. You shift slightly and listen again. Your movement produces a muted response, more felt than heard. The floor absorbs it. The walls swallow the rest. Above ground, every small action announces itself. Boards creak, snow crunches. Wind carries sound for miles. Here sound stays loyal. It belongs to its origin. This changes how safe you feel in ways that are hard to explain. Silence above ground can mean exposure. Silence below ground feels like insulation. You're not hidden exactly, but you are buffered. The world reaches you through layers softened by soil and sod. People who first slept underground often describe the quiet as unsettling. Accustomed to constant wind and structure noise, they struggle to interpret stillness. Over time, that discomfort reversed. Cabin noises began to feel intrusive. Underground, you learn to trust quiet as a sign of stability. Practical descriptions from sod house occupants often mention how storms passed almost unnoticed. Blizzards that buried fences and wagons made little impression below ground beyond a subtle pressure change or a faint vibration. The earth took the impact and kept the interior calm. That calm mattered. It conserved energy and reduced stress during long winters. You listen carefully now, not because you expect danger, but because listening is how you orient yourself. Underground sound becomes a close-range sense. You stop waiting for distant cues. Instead, you notice small things. breathing patterns, fabric shifting, the stove's quiet responses to cooling metal. A few frontier accounts describe people recognizing family members by how they moved at night, identifying them through vibrations rather than sound. One step pattern meant a child turning over. Another meant someone reaching for the stove. It was an awareness developed through repetition, not training. You realize that the quiet has changed your own movements. You move more slowly, more deliberately. There is no reason to be loud. Nothing needs announcing. Underground life encourages efficiency without hurry. Some observers later suggested that this muted environment reduced nighttime anxiety, particularly during storms. Others argue the opposite, pointing out that silence can amplify internal fears. The truth likely depended on temperament. What remains clear is that underground sleepers adapted their senses to suit the space they inhabited. You pause and listen for the wind out of habit. You cannot hear it, but you know it is there. You feel it instead as a faint pressure against the entrance, like a hand resting briefly on a door. That knowledge is enough. You do not need sound to confirm it. The stove emits a soft click as it settles. You register it immediately. Sound underground may not travel far, but it becomes meaningful. Every noise carries information. There is no background clutter to compete with it. You lie still and allow your hearing to relax. Silence stops being empty. It becomes filled with presence. The earth hums faintly, not audibly, but perceptibly. Weight exists, structure exists, shelter exists. That reassurance sinks in slowly. Some later writers romanticize this quiet as peaceful beyond comparison. Period reflections are more practical. People appreciated the lack of noise because it allowed rest. After days spent battling wind and cold nights without assault were a relief. You adjust your blanket slightly and hear the soft whisper of fabric. That sound feels close, intimate. It does not echo. It stays with you. You appreciate that. Privacy underground is not about walls and doors. It is about sound that does not escape. There are nights when animals move above you. Horses shift. Cattle settle. You feel them more than hear them. A low vibration passing through the ground. This connection feels grounding rather than threatening. It reminds you that life continues around you even if you are not fully part of it right now. You breathe slowly, letting the quiet deepen. Sleep approaches in waves. Each time you drift, you carry this altered sense of sound with you. Dreams feel closer, less cluttered. There is less interruption. Underground, the world becomes smaller but more manageable. Sound obeys different rules and you learn them quickly. The absence of noise does not mean absence of life, it means protection from excess. As your thoughts soften, you stop listening outward and begin listening inward. Breath, heartbeat, warmth building low. The earth holds steady. Sound stays where it belongs, and for tonight that quiet is exactly what you need. Darkness below ground does not arrive the way it does outside. It does not fall or spread. It simply exists steady and complete without edges to mark its shape. You notice this most when you open your eyes and nothing changes. No outline, no ceiling corner, just a uniform absence that feels thick rather than empty. You blink once, twice, expecting adjustment. It does not come. Underground darkness does not soften with time. It stays consistent like a held breath. This is the kind of dark that does not invite imagination to wander outward. It turns attention inward instead. You lie still and let your eyes close again. Sight offers little here. Other senses take over. You feel the blanket's weight, the warmth near your legs, the cool air above your shoulders. You smell earth and smoke faintly mingling. You hear almost nothing. This darkness is not frightening, it is contained. People unused to underground shelters has often struggled with this lack of visual variation. Contemporary letters describe visitors who found the nights disorienting, unable to tell whether minutes or hours had passed. Long-term residents adjusted. Without shifting shadows or moonlight, the body stopped anticipating changes that never came. Frontier living guides from the late 19th century sometimes advise keeping a small lamp burning overnight, not for light but to mark time and reduce anxiety. Others argued this wasted fuel and increased risk. Practices varied, shaped by temperament as much as practicality. You keep the lamp low or off entirely. Flame is responsibility here. Light also reveals moisture and movement that darkness keeps quiet. In the dark, the space feels unified. No corner draws attention, no wall demands inspection. Everything becomes equally present. A handful of settler diaries mention children playing games in complete darkness, testing how far they could move without touching walls. Adults rarely joined. They had already learned where the walls were and preferred not to think about them. This darkness changes sleep. Without visual cues, the body does not anchor itself to surface rhythms. You sleep when tired. You wake when cold or warmth shifts. Dreams blend more easily into waking moments. The boundary softens. Later commentators debated whether prolonged exposure to such darkness affected mood or perception. Some suggested it encouraged introspection. Others dismissed the idea, pointing out that people were too busy surviving to dwell on sensory theory. What remains undeniable is that underground darkness reshaped nightly experience. You shift slightly and feel the space respond. No shadows move. Nothing flickers. That consistency brings calm. There is no sudden change to startle you awake. Darkness does not play tricks here. You think briefly of stars of moonlight glinting off snow. Those images feel distant, almost abstract. They belong to another layer of life, one you step into during daylight hours. At night, underground, you accept a different arrangement. The darkness also hides imperfection. Crack stains, uneven walls all dissolve into uniformity. This grants a strange kind of mercy. The shelter feels more complete in the dark than it does in daylight. You're not reminded of its roughness, only its function. You breathe slowly and let your muscles loosen. Without sight, you stop scanning for problems. You trust touch and sound instead. This trust deepens with repetition. After weeks underground, people often reported feeling more unsettled by open darkness outside than by the enclosed dark below. You adjust your head position slightly and feel warmth shift. That sensation replaces sight as your guide. Heat becomes your landmark. You orient yourself by temperature rather than vision. As sleep settles in again, darkness becomes less a condition and more a background. It holds you without demanding attention. The night stretches, but it does not feel endless, it feels paused. Underground darkness does not hide danger or promise safety. It simply removes distraction. You rest within it, wrapped in layers, surrounded by earth, aware only of what matters in this moment. Warmth, stillness, breath, and in that uniform dark you let go. You learn quickly that a stove underground is never truly asleep. Even when the fire is settled into embers, it continues to work quietly, radiating just enough warmth to keep the space from tipping back into sharp cold. You wake not because you're freezing, but because something in the air has shifted. Heat has thinned. The night has reached its coldest point. You sit up slowly, already reaching for fuel. This movement happens before thought. Underground sleepers develop a timing that feels instinctive. Fires are not kept blazing. They are kept alive. A roaring stove wastes fuel and dries the air too quickly. A dying one invites frost. The balance is narrow and familiar. You open the stove door just enough to feed it. Faint glow responds, followed by a soft rush as air moves. You close the door again and wait. The stove ticks metal, adjusting to change. That sound becomes one of the most reassuring noises you know. It means warmth is on its way. Frontier winterers demanded constant attention to fire regardless of shelter type. Accounts from across the plains make it clear that families planned their nights around fuel management, often banking coals carefully before sleep to stretch heat through the coldest hours. Underground shelters made this easier by slowing heat loss, not by eliminating the need for care. You settle back down closer to the stove now. Heat spreads outward in a gentle gradient. Your legs warm first, then your hands. The air near the ceiling remains cool, a reminder that warmth belongs low. You arrange yourself accordingly, curling, slightly conserving what the stove offers. Some people slept in shifts during severe cold, one person resting while another tended the fire. Others trusted their construction enough to sleep through waking only if the cold insisted. Practices varied widely. What united them was attentiveness. Fire underground is both ally and responsibility. A small but telling habit appears in several winter recollections. People kept a poker or iron rod within arm's reach of their bedding, not for defence but to adjust embers without fully rising. Small movements conserved warmth. Efficiency extended even to how far one reached in the dark. You breathe in slowly and notice how the air feels drier near the stove. Heat drives moisture towards cooler walls. This shift requires monitoring. Too much dryness cracks skin and sinuses. Too much dampness steals warmth. You learn to read the air with your lungs, adjusting vents and fuel by sensation rather than measurement. Later examinations of sod house living often focus on insulation and structure, but nightly routines mattered just as much. The shelter worked because people worked with it. Fire was not a background element. It was an active partner in survival. You lie still again as warmth stabilizes. The stove's presence is steady now, no longer demanding attention. This is the goal. You want heat that does not interrupt rest. Underground shelters excelled at this when built and managed well. There are nights when the fire misbehaves, smoke backs up, embers die unexpectedly. Those nights remain vivid in memory. But most nights pass quietly, marked only by this brief waking and return to sleep. Over time you stop remembering individual nights at all. They blend into a season of careful repetition. Some later writers suggested that tending fire through the night created constant anxiety. Period reflections suggest something subtler. The routine became comforting. Waking to check embers felt purposeful rather than stressful. It confirmed that you were still present, still warm, still alive. You shift once more, feeling heat settle around you like a held breath. The stove no longer speaks. The earth absorbs and reflects warmth, doing its share of the work. Above you the cold presses down, relentless and patient. Below, fire and soil collaborate quietly. Your eyes close again. Sleep returns deeper this time, anchored by warmth that does not demand your attention. The stove will not sleep fully tonight, but you can. And underground that small mercy matters more than anything else. You wake to the faint sting inside your nose, a cool sharpness that tells you the night reached its lowest point while you slept. Breath behaves differently underground. It does not vanish into open air. It lingers just long enough to be noticed. You exhale slowly and watch nothing happen. The darkness hides what your body already knows. You raise a hand and feel it before you see it. The air near your face feels dry, but above, closer to the ceiling, cold has gathered. That is where breath goes when it leaves you drifting upward, cooling, settling. By morning it leaves behind its quiet signature. You sit up and bring a lantern close, shielding the flame. Tiny crystals catch the light along the upper wall, scattered like frost on stone. They are delicate, easy to miss if you're not looking for them. Frozen breath. Evidence of a night well below freezing outside contained just enough to keep you alive inside. Winter journals from across the plains mention this sight, often sometimes with surprise, sometimes with resignation. People learned to read the patterns. Heavy frost meant vents were too tight. No frost meant too much heat escaping. The walls told the story if you paid attention. You wipe a section gently with your sleeve. The crystals melt immediately, soaking into the fabric. You hang the sleeve closer to the stove to dry later. This exchange repeats itself daily. Melt, dry, freeze again. Underground life is built on cycles like this. Some settlers treated frozen breath as a nuisance. Others saw it as reassurance. If breath froze on the walls instead of in the air, it meant warmth stayed low where bodies rested. A detail like that could calm nerves during long stretches of severe cold. You notice that your blanket feels slightly stiff near the edges. Moisture settled there overnight. You shake it gently, loosening fibres, then reposition it closer to the stove. Dryness returns slowly. Nothing happens quickly underground. Patience becomes habit. There are accounts of people waking to find hair and eyelashes dusted with frost after nights spent in poorly vented shelters. Those moments lingered in memory, retold with a mix of humour and warning. They reminded everyone that even underground winter still found ways to announce itself. You take a careful breath, gauging the air. It feels clean enough. You crack the entrance just a finger's width. Cold rushes in, immediately sharp and alert. You welcome it briefly, then close the opening again. Fresh air matters even when it hurts. Later interpretations of frontier housing sometimes suggest underground shelters were unhealthy because of stale air. The lived reality appears more nuanced. People adjusted constantly, opening and closing vents, responding to smell and breath rather than strict rules. Survival favoured attention over perfection. You settle back down, waiting for the stove to reclaim the space. Heat rises slowly, softening the crystals you missed. They melt silently, leaving darkened patches behind. By midday, those patches will fade. By night, they may return. Your breathing slows again. You tuck your chin slightly, conserving warmth. The space feels smaller this morning, not because it changed, but because you're more aware of it. Awareness sharpens with repetition. You know where cold collects now. You know where warmth stays. As sleep pulls at you again, lighter this time, you register one last detail. The air near the floor feels almost comfortable. The earth has held on to heat through the night, releasing it steadily. Breath may freeze above, but below life continues undisturbed. You close your eyes and let the day wait. Frozen breath on the walls is not a threat. It is a message. Winter is outside doing what it does. Underground, you are still breathing, still warm enough, still sheltered. And for now, that balance holds. You never fully undress anymore. That habit faded quietly without discussion the way many winter habits do. Clothing becomes a second skin rather than something you shed at night. You loosen layers, adjust them, but you keep enough on that standing up quickly would not shock your body into panic. You wake halfway through the night and realize you're already prepared. Boots within reach, coat folded nearby, not neatly, just efficiently. Gloves tucked into a sleeve so they stay warm. This arrangement happens naturally over time. No one instructs you. Experience teaches faster than advice ever could. Winter accounts from frontier families often note that nightwear blurred into daywear during the coldest months. Shirts, trousers, woolen dresses and stockings stayed on through sleep, sometimes augmented with extra layers added just before lying down. Undressing fully wasted heat and made morning movement painful. Practicality won the argument. You adjust a sleeve and feel stiffness where moisture dried unevenly. Wool handles this better than cotton. People learned that lesson early, sometimes the hard way. Cotton holds dampness and steals warmth. Wool forgives mistakes. It insulates even when not perfectly dry. That knowledge spread without textbooks, carried in sore joints and restless nights. You shift and notice how your clothing rustles softly. The sound feels close contained. Underground, even fabric noise seems quieter. That quiet encourages minimal movement. You turn only when necessary, guarding warmth, the way you would guard a small fire from wind. Some settlers slept with scarves wrapped loosely around their necks, not for warmth exactly, but to control breathing. Cold air hitting the throat could trigger coughing fits that lingered for days. A strip of cloth softened each inhale. It was a small precaution with outsized impact. You test the air with a breath through your nose. It feels cool but not harsh. That tells you your layers are doing their job. Clothing at night is less about insulation and more about moderation. Too much heat leads to sweat. Sweat leads to danger. The goal is steady, not warmness warm. There are recollections of people sleeping in hats through winter nights, especially children. Heads lose heat quickly. A wool cap added little weight and saved precious warmth. Some adults resisted this at first, clinging to habits from milder climates. Most adapted. Later observers sometimes framed this constant layering as misery. The lived reality was more measured. Clothing became part of the shelter itself, a flexible barrier that adjusted with need. Walls stayed fixed, layers moved. You pull a blanket slightly higher and feel fabric settle against wool beneath. The combination works together. Each layer handles a different task, some trap air, some block drafts, some absorb moisture. None are perfect alone. A small detail appears in several winter letters from the plains. People often slept with tomorrow's clothing folded inside their blankets, not for convenience, but to keep garments from freezing stiff by morning. Dressing in warm clothes saved time and pain. It also conserved energy for work that mattered more. You think briefly about morning, then let the thought pass. Underground nights stretch long. There is no need to rush toward daylight. You exist inside a controlled pause held between fire and earth. As you lie still, your body finds equilibrium. Clothing warms where it should and breathes where it must. You feel neither hot nor cold. This neutrality is the real success of winter sleeping. Comfort is rare. Balance is achievable. Some modern interpretations suggest that constant night layering disrupted sleep quality. Period reflections suggest the opposite. Once the body adjusted, sleep deepened. There were fewer sharp wake-ups, fewer shocks from cold drafts, The predictability allowed rest. You shift one last time, then stop. Your layers have settled. The stove hums faintly nearby. The earth holds steady beneath you. Clothing rests between doing its quiet work without complaint. Outside, winter continues its patient testing. Inside, you meet it layer by layer, refusing drama. You breathe slowly, wrapped in fabric, chosen not for beauty, but for survival. Sleep returns heavy and practical, a kind earned through adaptation rather than comfort. Warmth feels different when it comes from another body. You notice it immediately, not as heat exactly, but as a soft resistance against the cold. A presence beside you changes how air moves, how blankets settle, how quickly chill creeps back in when the fire dips low. Underground shared space is not sentimental, it is practical. You lie closer now, shoulders nearly touching, backs turned or faces angled away to make room. There is an unspoken geometry to it. Everyone learns where to place themselves, so warmth overlaps instead of dispersing. You do not cling, you align. Families on the frontier often slept together during winter, not because privacy was ignored, but because heat mattered more than distance. Letters and household accounts from sod houses and dugouts describe entire families sleeping in one room, sometimes on a single large pallet, sometimes in overlapping rows along the warmest wall. The arrangement shifted as children grew and seasons changed. You feel the rise and fall of breathing beside you. It steadies your own. That rhythm becomes part of the night's background, as reliable as the stove's quiet ticks. Shared warmth works best when bodies remain still. Excess movement breaks the fragile balance you have built. Children adapt to this quickly. They curl inward without instruction, knees tucked, hands drawn close to their chests. Adults take longer, pride lingers, so does the memory of separate beds and personal space. But winter does not negotiate with memory. It rewards efficiency. There are small adjustments made without words. A blanket pulled slightly higher on one side, a shoulder eased back when heat builds too much. These movements happen half asleep, guided by sensation rather than thought. Some observers later suggested that such close sleeping blurred boundaries in uncomfortable ways. Others pointed out that these arrangements were seasonal, not permanent. Warm months restored distance. Winter compressed life temporarily, then released it again. You notice how much quieter the space feels now. Shared breathing fills the silence just enough to soften it. Underground nights can feel vast despite the closeness of walls. Bodies nearby shrink that space into something manageable. A detail easy to miss appears in several winter recollections. People often place the smallest children between adults not out of affection alone, but because adults generated more heat and shielded children from drafts. It was a living barrier adjusted night by night. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb anyone. The warmth near you holds. You feel it radiate slowly, blending with heat from the stove and the ground beneath. This layering of sources matters. No single element carries the night alone. The air grows heavier as shared breath accumulates. You crack a vent briefly, just enough to refresh without stealing warmth. Cold slips in sharp and brief, then retreats. Balance returns. Later reflections sometimes paint these nights as crowded and uncomfortable. Period voices tell a quieter story. People complained, yes, but they also slept. They rested because they had to. Exhaustion smooths many inconveniences. You let your body relax fully now, trusting the arrangement. Shared warmth reduces the need to wake, to tend the fire, to adjust constantly. That rest carries into the day, conserving strength for work that cannot wait. As sleep deepens, boundaries blur further. You are aware of presence without tracking details. Breath becomes sound, sound becomes rhythm, rhythm becomes background. Outside, the cold presses against the earth without mercy. Inside, warmth circulates slowly past from body to body, held in place by walls of soil and patience. You drift, wake briefly, then drift again. Each time the warmth is still there. That constancy builds trust. By morning you will rise stiff but rested, aware that closeness carried you through another long night. For now you stay where you are, underground, layered, shared, letting warmth move between bodies the way it always has, quietly without asking permission. You sense them before you hear them. A shift in weight somewhere beyond the wall. A low vibration, passing through the floor too slow and heavy to belong to wind. Animals do not announce themselves underground. They register as pressure, as movement translated through soil rather than sound. You lie still and let the sensation resolve. A horse adjusting its stance, cattle settling into the cold, maybe a mule stamping once irritated by snow crusting around its hooves. These movements travel downwards, softened, stretched out by earth. They feel distant but connected, like a reminder that life continues just beyond your shelter. Many frontier homesteads placed livestock close to dugouts and sod houses during winter, not only for convenience but for survival. Animals provided a steady source of heat simply by existing nearby. Their body warmth seeped into the ground and drifted inward, subtle but real. People noticed the difference immediately when stock were moved farther away. You feel that difference now? The wall nearest the animals holds warmth better. Not dramatically, just enough to matter. You choose your sleeping spot accordingly. Everyone does, even if no one says it aloud. There is also reassurance in knowing where the animals are. Predators think twice before approaching a cluster of large bodies. Livestock noise, even muffled signals occupation. Underground, where sight offers little information, these signs become important. A small habit appears in several winter accounts. People listen for animals at night, not out of worry but comfort. A sudden silence could mean trouble. A steady pattern meant all was well. You do the same now, registering the slow rhythm of movement above you. You imagine the animals breathing steam, rising into cold air, frost forming on hides and manes. Their endurance mirrors your own. They stand through nights that would break lesser creatures. You draw comfort from that shared resistance. Some later interpretations suggested that keeping animals so close was unsanitary or unpleasant. In practice, winter changed priorities. Warmth, safety, and efficiency outweighed concerns that felt distant when temperatures dropped hard and fast. Spring brought separation, winter brought proximity. You notice another vibration lighter this time. Chickens shifting on their roost. Their presence adds little heat, but their activity marks time. They settle early, they stir before dawn. Underground, you feel these changes rather than see them. The animals also mask your own presence. Sounds you make blend into a larger background of life. This mattered in regions where isolation made people uneasy. Being surrounded by living creatures softened that edge. You adjust your blanket and feel warmth settle more evenly now. The wall beside you no longer feels as cool. The earth has absorbed heat from above and is releasing it slowly, generously. There are nights when storms drive animals closer still. On those nights, vibrations increase. The ground feels almost alive beneath you, pulsing gently with movement. It can be startling at first. Over time, it becomes familiar. You listen again, not with ears alone, but with your body. The rhythm remains steady. No frantic movement, no sudden shifts. That steadiness tells you the night is passing normally. As sleep returns, you accept this quiet companionship. Underground life rarely feels solitary even when alone. The earth connects you to what moves above it. Outside, animals endure the cold directly. Inside, you borrow some of their warmth without disturbing them. It is an unspoken exchange, part of the winter arrangement. You drift aware of life just beyond reach, reassured by its presence. The ground holds you both, mediating between exposure and shelter. And as long as those slow vibrations continue, you rest easier, knowing you are not facing the night alone. The storm arrives without ceremony. There is no warning howl, no rising pitch in the air. You only sense it when the ground seems to press a little harder, as if the weight above you has increased. Snow does that. It stacks itself patiently, layer upon layer, until the world feels heavier rather than louder. You lie still and listen out of habit more than concern. Nothing reaches you clearly, no wind tearing at corners, no ice rattling loose boards. The storm is happening somewhere else, translated into pressure and silence by the earth between you and the sky. People who slept underground often remarked on this strange disconnect. Blizzards that erased fences and swallowed wagons left barely a whisper below ground. Settlers would emerge after a night's rest to find the landscape transformed, as if winter had worked while they slept. That quiet passage of violence felt unreal at first, then deeply reassuring. You shift slightly and feel warmth hold. The shelter does not react to the storm. Walls do not flex. The ceiling does not complain. Earth accepts snow the way it accepts everything else, without drama. That steadiness seeps into you. Outside wind scours open land, piling drifts against anything that resists. Underground resistance is minimal. The shelter does not fight winter. It yields space and lets the elements pass overhead. This philosophy of survival appears again and again in frontier choices. People learned that confronting nature head-on wasted energy. Working with it conserved life. You remember nights above ground when storms kept you awake, wind probing every seam, every knot in the wood. Each gust demanded attention. Underground attention softens. You're aware something is happening, but it does not demand action. Snow adds insulation as it falls. Each inch of you traps heat more effectively. By morning, the shelter may be warmer than it was at dusk. This counterintuitive comfort surprised newcomers. Cold brought warmth not because winter was kind, but because earth and snow worked together efficiently. A few winter letters describe people sleeping through storms so fierce they later struggled to open their doors. Snow packed tightly against entrances, sealing them in silence. Inside they rested undisturbed, unaware, until morning that escape would require effort. That disconnect felt unsettling and reassuring at once. You breathe slowly, letting the storm exist without you. The space around you feels sealed but not suffocating. Air still moves slowly, deliberately. The vent breathes, the stove hums faintly. Life continues at a measured pace. Some later commentators argued that this quiet during storms dulled awareness, making people less prepared for morning challenges. Others noted the opposite. Rested bodies handled digging and repair better than exhausted ones. Sleep became a form of preparation rather than avoidance. You listen again, focusing on subtle cues. A faint tremor as snow slides from a sod roof. A dull thud as a drift settles. These sounds arrive softened like echoes remembered rather than heard. They do not startle you. They confirm the shelter is holding. You think briefly of those outside, animals enduring wind and snow directly, trees bending grasses buried. The storm works hard above you. Below you conserve energy. That division feels fair. Winter will demand its price in daylight hours. Night offers respite. As the storm deepens, darkness feels heavier, more complete. Snow blocks what little light might have filtered in. The space becomes fully enclosed. This total isolation might have frightened some, but you find it calming. There is nothing to see, nothing to manage, just warmth, breath, stillness. Accounts from sod house dwellers often mention waking during storms not from noise but from warmth. As snow piled on, insulation improved. People would stir confused by the sudden comfort, then realize what had happened. Cold weather paradoxically brought relief. You adjust your blanket once, then stop. Movement feels unnecessary. The shelter is doing all the work. Earth, snow, and fire cooperate without instruction. Later examinations of underground living sometimes focus on the danger of collapse during heavy storms. Those concerns were real but relatively rare in winter when frozen ground held firm. Thaw posed greater risk than snow. Winter, for all its brutality, offered stability underground. You drift again, sleep, pulling you deeper now. Dreams come softly untroubled by wind or noise. When you wake briefly, you cannot tell how long you slept. Time loses its sharp edges underground, especially during storms. Eventually the storm passes, though you do not mark the moment. Pressure eases slightly. The ground relaxes. Snow settles into stillness. All of this happens without announcement. You remain sheltered, wrapped in warmth, earned by earth and patience. Above you the world reshapes itself under winter's hand. Below you rest barely aware, carried through the night by a storm you hardly heard at all. Time slips sideways underground. You do not lose it exactly, but it stops moving the way you expect. Without sunlight to carve the night into recognizable pieces, hours blur into something softer. You wake, rest, drift again, never quite sure how long each stretch lasts. The clock, if you have one at all, becomes decorative. You sense morning not by brightness but by temperature. Cold gathers briefly, then recedes as the stove regains its rhythm. Somewhere above you dawn exists. Down here it feels distant and optional. People living below ground learn to abandon rigid schedules in winter. Work followed light and weather when it could. Rest filled the gaps. Diaries from sod houses often mention days measured by tasks completed rather than hours passed. Time became something you responded to, not something you chased. You sit up slowly and notice how your body feels. Stiff but rested. That combination tells you the night did its job. Underground sleep may be lighter, but it is deeper in its own way. There are fewer interruptions, fewer sudden alarms from wind or cracking wood. You glance toward the entrance. A faint greyness filters in, more suggestion than illumination. Snow muffles light as effectively as it muffles sound. The world above is still wrapped tight. A curious pattern appears in winter journals. People often underestimated how long they had slept underground, assuming they were awake more than they actually were. The lack of visual cues distorted perception. Rest felt fragmented even when it was sufficient. You stretch carefully, mindful of the low ceiling. This movement sends warmth through your muscles, easing stiffness. You pause, letting it settle. Sudden motion invites chill. Slow movement preserves heat. Some later observers claimed underground living disrupted natural rhythms. Others noted that frontier life rarely followed natural rhythms to begin with. Work, weather, and survival dictated sleep far more than sunrise ever could. Underground shelters simply made that reality more apparent. You breathe in and notice how the air has shifted. Less heavy now, fresher. That tells you vents have done their quiet work through the night. You crack the door briefly anyway, more out of habit than need. Cold rushes in sharp and honest. You close it again and smile faintly at your own caution. The stove responds to fresh fuel with a low, steady warmth. You sit nearby, letting heat reach you gradually. Underground mornings are about re-entry, not escape. You do not burst into the day, you ease into it. As you wait, your thoughts wander. Time underground encourages this. Without clocks or views to anchor attention, the mind drifts inward. Some people found this unsettling, others found it clarifying. The space demanded little leaving room for thought. You remember tasks waiting above, snow to clear, animals to check, tools to warm before use. None of this feels urgent yet. Underground urgency softens. You emerge when ready, not when pressured. Several accounts describe people lingering underground longer than necessary on bitter mornings, letting the shelter do its work before facing the cold. This was not laziness, it was strategy. Starting the day warm conserved energy that mattered later. You glance at the entrance again. Light has strengthened slightly. Morning is making its case. You gather your layers, preparing to move. Everything has its place. Boots are warm enough to bend, gloves are flexible, clothing holds heat. Time resumes its usual shape as you stand. Above ground, the day will assert itself quickly. Wind glare, cold. Underground, you had the luxury of a softer transition. You take one last breath in the stillness, aware that this pause is temporary. The shelter has held you through another long stretch of winter darkness. It has bent time just enough to make survival manageable. When you finally step toward the entrance, you carry that altered sense of time with you. It lingers, slowing you down even after daylight returns. Underground living teaches patience not as a virtue but as a necessity. Voices surface gently once the work of staying warm has settled into routine. No one announces the moment. It simply happens. Someone clears a throat. Someone else offers a sentence into the dimness, testing whether the space is ready to listen. Underground stories do not begin with signals. They emerge when movement has nowhere else to go. You lie still and let the sound reach you. The voice does not travel far, but it does not need to. It fills the space, evenly softened by earthen walls that refuse to echo. Words arrive slower here, shaped by breath and patience. Each sentence has weight. No one rushes. Winter nights made storytellers of people who never thought of themselves that way. With hands idle and darkness complete, memory became entertainment and instruction at once. People talked about weather patterns. They remembered animals they had known, places left behind. These stories were not polished. They were useful. You notice how the rhythm of speech changes underground. Louder voices feel unnecessary. Quieter ones feel more honest. Stories adapt to the space, becoming measured almost careful. The earth seems to ask for restraint, and people oblige without being asked. Many winter recollections mention evenings spent talking in low voices long after lamps were dimmed. Without light, faces faded into suggestion. Attention shifted fully to sound. This made listening easier. You were not distracted by expressions or gestures. The voice carried everything. A small detail shows up in a handful of accounts. People often paused stories when the stove made a sound and then resumed once it settled. The fire was part of the conversation. Its needs were acknowledged without irritation. You listen as someone recounts a memory from another winter, another place. The details blur at the edges, but the feeling remains clear. Cold. Waiting. Relief when morning came. These stories do not aim to impress, they aim to reassure. Children drift in and out of sleep during these moments. They listen until the sound becomes background, then let it carry them away. Adults stay awake longer, drawn by the comfort of shared experience. Underground nights shrink the distance between people. There is little else to do but be present. Some later observers suggested that storytelling filled a psychological gap created by isolation. Others saw it as continuation of older traditions brought west. The reality appears less tidy. People talked because talking passed time and made darkness feel inhabited. That was reason enough. You feel warmth shift as bodies relax. Laughter is rare, but smiles happen anyway. Humor exists just quieter. A comment about a stubborn mule, a memory of a meal that went wrong. These small moments break tension without shattering calm. You notice how stories end without conclusions. Someone trails off, another person takes over. The night accepts these unfinished threads. There is no need to wrap anything up neatly. Winter itself resists neat endings. At some point the talking fades. Not because anyone signals an end, but because words have done their work. Silence returns thicker now, carrying the residue of shared sound. Space feels fuller than before. You lie there, breathing slowly, aware of others nearby, even if they no longer speak. That awareness lingers longer than the stories themselves. It turns solitude into something shared rather than lonely. There are nights when no one talks at all. Those nights feel different, heavier. When stories do come, they lighten the air without raising the temperature. They warm in another way. Some people later claim they remembered winter stories more clearly than summer ones. Perhaps the darkness sharpened attention. Perhaps scarcity made moments stand out. Or perhaps time simply slowed enough underground for memories to sink deeper. You adjust your blanket and let your eyes remain closed. Words echo faintly in your mind, not as sentences, but as tones. Calm, familiar, steady. The stove settles again, metal softening as heat stabilizes. The night stretches on, but it no longer feels empty. Stories have marked it, dividing it into something navigable. As sleep pulls you under, you realize that underground nights were never meant to be endured alone. Even in seance, the presence of others carries you through. Voices come and go, but their warmth lingers, just like the heat in the ground. Worry does not announce itself loudly underground. It slips in quietly, usually during moments of stillness when the night feels especially heavy. You lie there and become aware of the ceiling, not as shelter, but as mass. Earth above you is steady, but it is also real. Weight exists. That awareness never fully disappears. You shift slightly and listen as if sound might confirm stability. It does in its own way. Nothing creaks, nothing groans. The earth holds its shape without complaint. Still the thought lingers, tucked into the back of your mind where it does not interfere but does not leave. People who live below ground understood this balance well. They trusted their shelters, but not blindly. Careful digging, proper angles, and attention to drainage mattered. Winter, with its frozen ground, was generally kind in this regard. Frozen soil stayed firm. Trouble came later when thaw softened what cold had locked in place. You picture rain soaking into the ground above, imagine water seeking the easiest path downward. That image brings a flicker of tension. You respond by checking what you can control. You feel the floor beneath you. Firm, you note the smell of the air, earthy but not wet. These checks become second nature, quiet reassurances repeated without drama. Some early settlers wrote about collapse with a kind of wary repexipao rather than fear. It happened, but not often. When it did, it was usually tied to poor sighting or impatience. Digging straight down instead of angling walls, ignoring slope, choosing convenience over caution. Stories circulated, serving as reminders rather than warnings. You reach up and touch the ceiling briefly, not pressing, just confirming its presence. The surface feels solid, cool, unmoving. That touch grounds you more than thought ever could. Flooding worried people more than collapse in many regions. Meltwater followed gravity without sentiment. You keep bedding away from low spots for that reason. You learn to read the floor the way you read weather, noticing subtle changes in texture and firmness. Later interpretations sometimes portray underground life as constant anxiety. The quieter truth is that concern existed, but it was managed. People adjusted behavior instead of dwelling on risk. Attention replaced fear. Routine and replaced panic. You listen again, tuning into vibrations rather than sounds. Everything feels stable. No shifting weight. No unusual tremors. The animals above move normally. The stove hums softly. These cues reassure you more than logic ever could. You let the thought fade, not because it was wrong, but because it has been answered. The shelter holds. Tonight is not the night for trouble. Winter nights rarely were. Ironically, the harshness of cold made the ground predictable. You settle deeper into your bedding, shoulders relaxing. Worry loosens its grip and drifts away, replaced by fatigue, the kind earned through days of careful living. As sleep returns, you accept the presence of the earth above you without questioning it further. Weight becomes protection again. Stillness becomes trust. Underground fear does not vanish. It learns its place. Morning does not arrive underground so much as it seeps in. You sense it before you see it, a subtle loosening in the air, a shift in temperature that tells you the night has released its grip. Light follows, slowly filtering through the entrance in thin layers rather than sudden brightness. You sit up and wait. This is not hesitation. It is transition. Underground living teaches you not to rush from rest into exposure. You let your body adjust, letting warmth build before you face the cold that still waits above. You move closer to the entrance and look up. Snow has piled during the night, pressing in from the outside. The opening is smaller now, its edges softened and reshaped. This is expected. Winter rarely leaves doors the way it found them. People who slept in dugouts and sod houses learned to clear entrances first thing often before eating or tending animals. Without doing so, fresh air remained limited, and escape became difficult if conditions worsened. Clearing snow was not a chore, it was maintenance of life. You push gently at first, testing resistance. Snow does not move all at once. It yields in stages, cracking softly, then collapsing inward with a dull rush. Cold air spills through immediately, sharp and dry, filling the space with the scent of open land. You pause, breathing it in carefully. Too much cold at once steals warmth. You step back, letting the shelter recover before pushing again. This back and forth continues until the opening is clear enough to manage safely. A detail that appears in several winter accounts is how familiar this motion became. Push, wait, breathe, push again. People described it as a morning ritual, as ingrained as lighting the stove or pulling on boots. Muscle memory took over where thought might hesitate. Once the entrance is open, light changes the space completely. Shadows sharpen, walls reveal damp patches and soot marks. The shelter looks rougher by day. That contrast explains why darkness felt kind. It softened edges and hid flaws. You step partly outside, careful not to track snow back in. Wind hits your face immediately, reminding you what you have been spared through the night. The cold feels more aggressive here, more demanding. You do not linger. You turn back inside to finish warming yourself before fully emerging. Underground mornings reward patience. Rushing into the cold undoes the work the shelter has done. Some later reflections portray this moment as claustrophobic or difficult. For those living it, it was simply part of the rhythm. The entrance did not feel like a barrier. It felt like a threshold that required attention. You brush snow from your sleeves and check the stove. It has held through the night. Embers glow faintly enough to bring back warmth quickly. You feed it and wait, letting heat spread before dressing fully. Light continues to strengthen as snow reflects it inward. The world above reveals itself gradually. No sudden shock, just steady re-entry. You think briefly of how different mornings feel in open cabins where cold rushes in unfiltered. Here you choose when to face it. That choice matters more than comfort. It preserves strength. Once ready, you step outside fully. Snow stretches in smooth, reshaped lines. Fences are half buried. Tracks from yesterday are gone. Winter has edited the landscape while you slept. You turn back to the entrance, now clearly visible in daylight. From the outside, it barely looks like a home. Just a cut in the earth, a low door, a mound of snow. Inside it carried you through the night. You close the door gently behind you, sealing warmth inside for later. The day waits, work waits, but you step into it rested, not battered by the night. Underground, you learned how to let winter pass over you without taking everything it could. Digging out after snow is never a single motion. It is a conversation with resistance. You learn this the moment your shovel meets the drift, not as powder, but as something packed and opinionated. Snow that falls slowly settles into itself. Snow driven by wind arrives already compacted, ready to argue. You plant your feet carefully and begin. The first scoop breaks the surface, the second finds weight. By the third, your arms have learned the truth. This will take time. That knowledge does not discourage you. It simply sets the pace. People who lived through frontier winters came to expect this task as part of the morning, especially after storms. Snow clearing was not separate from shelter maintenance. It was shelter maintenance. Paths had to be reopened. Entrances had to breathe again. Ignoring this work invited trouble later. You shovel in stages, lifting and tossing just far enough to keep the opening clear. Too far wastes energy. Too close means you'll do the work twice. These judgments become instinctive with repetition. Cold sharpens effort. Your breath fogs immediately rising and vanishing in the air. You pause often, not from weakness but from experience. Overexertion leads to sweat. Sweat leads to danger. Winter rewards restraint. As you work, you notice how quiet the world feels after a storm. Snow absorbs sound the way earth does. Even above ground, everything seems hushed. The absence of wind makes the cold feel heavier, more deliberate. A small but persistent habit shows up in winter recollections. People often kept shovels or digging tools just inside their shelters rather than outside. Tools left outdoors froze stiff handles, cracking metal, biting bare hands. Warm tools moved snow faster and safer. You clear enough space to open the door fully, then stop. That is enough for now. You retreat underground, briefly letting warmth return to your hands. This back and forth repeats until the job is done. Underground living teaches you to think in intervals rather than continuous effort. You sit and flex your fingers near the stove. Heat stings slightly at first, then soothes. Blood returns tingling. You wait until the minute feels easy again before heading back out. Snow clearing also reveals what the night has hidden. Drifts pile unevenly. Some areas remain surprisingly bare. Others rise shoulder high. The land reshapes itself without asking permission. You learn not to take yesterday's paths for granted. In some regions, people marked doorways with tall poles or branches before winter deepened, giving themselves a reference point when snow erased familiar outlines. Without these markers, finding an entrance after a heavy storm could take longer than expected. You shovel against slower now, more rhythm than force. Lift, turn, drop, the repetition steadies your breathing. Muscles warm, cold recedes slightly pushed back by motion and purpose. There is a quiet satisfaction in uncovering what winter tried to hide. Not triumph, just restoration. You are not conquering snow, you are negotiating with it. Later observers sometimes frame these daily labours as relentless hardship. People living it describe something more neutral. It was work, yes, but it was predictable work. Predictability brings comfort in harsh conditions. You finish clearing the entrance and step back to inspect it. The doorway breathes again. Air moves freely. Light reaches inside. That is the goal. You knock snow from your boots and return underground one last time to warm fully. This pause matters. Starting the day cold leads to mistakes. Underground mornings allow for correction before exposure. As you sit, you notice how quickly the shelter regains its equilibrium. The door closed, heat returns. The earth does not mind brief interruptions, it adjusts. You think about how many winters taught these lessons, each one reinforcing the same principles. Work in stages. Protect warmth. Respect limits. These habits outlast the shelters themselves. When you step out again, ready now, the cold feels manageable. Not friendly, but honest. You shoulder your shovel and move on to the next task, knowing you can always retreat underground if needed. Digging out after snow is never the end of the work. It is the opening move, and underground living ensures you begin that move rested, warmed and prepared rather than already spent. Health becomes a quiet calculation underground. You do not think about it directly, not in the way people do, when something has already gone wrong. Instead, you notice small things and adjust before they turn into problems. The air feels thick. You open a vent. A cough lingers. You add moisture or warmth. Nothing dramatic, just steady attention. Close quarters change how illness behaves. When bodies share space, breath mixes. Heat concentrates, so does fatigue. Underground shelters amplified this reality, not because they were careless, but because winter demanded closeness. Distance was a luxury reserved for warmer months. People living through long winters understood that staying warm and staying healthy were not always the same goal. Too much warmth encouraged dampness. Dampness invited chills that settled deep. Too much air circulation stole heat and weakened bodies already working hard. Balance was everything. You notice how quickly smells change when someone is unwell. Breath sharpens, sweat turns sour. These signs register early underground. There is nowhere for them to hide. Families learn to respond quietly, shifting sleeping positions, adjusting ventilation, offering warm drinks before symptoms grew teeth. Winter routines across the plains reveal how seriously people took these small signals. Hot broths were favoured not just for nutrition, but for hydration and warmth combined. Warm liquids reached places solid food could not. People sipped slowly even at night if someone felt off. You adjust your own position, aware of how your breath feels. Clear, easy, that reassures you. You pull your blanket closer but avoid wrapping too tightly. Overheating leads to sweating. Sweating leads to trouble. Underground moderation protects more reliably than excess. There are accounts of people keeping simple remedies close at hand through winter nights. Honey if available. Onion poultices, herbal teas made from whatever could be stored dry. These were not cures. They were comfort and prevention. They bought time. Later readings of Frontier Health often focus on dramatic illness and mortality. Those stories exist, but they overshadow the quieter truth. Most nights passed without crisis because people paid attention early. They adjusted habits before sickness took root. You notice how stillness affects breathing. Lying too flat can make the chest feel heavy. People learn to prop themselves slightly using rolled blankets or clothing. Small changes like this improved sleep and reduced coughing. Underground living encouraged these improvisations. Children were watched closely. Their bodies changed faster. Adults slept lighter when a child stirred unusually. Shared space meant shared vigilance. Rest was important, but awareness never fully shut off. Some observers later suggested underground shelters must have bred disease. Others noted that cold itself suppressed many infections. The lived experience varied by place and season. What mattered most was cleanliness within limits and constant adjustment. You sit up briefly and stretch, encouraging circulation. Movement matters even at night. Then you settle again, breathing evenly. The space feels stable, warm enough. Fresh to know of. Health underground is not about perfection. It is about staying just ahead of decline. Paying attention before discomfort becomes illness. This attentiveness becomes second nature, another quiet skill winter teaches. As sleep returns, you trust the balance you have built. Air moves. Warmth holds. Breath stays easy. Underground survival often depended less on strength than on noticing small changes and responding without delay. You close your eyes reassured, not by certainty but by vigilance. The night passes not because nothing could go wrong, but because you are ready if it does. That readiness practiced nightly keeps health intact through long winters spent beneath the earth. Children sleep differently underground, you notice it quickly. While adults lie alert, half listening, half resting, children surrender. They curl inward and disappear into sleep with a trust that feels almost reckless. Cold does not trouble them in the same way. Darkness does not unsettle them. They adapt without commentary. You watch this happen night after night. A child stirs, finds warmth and settles again without waking fully. Their breathing evens out faster than yours ever does. Underground, where routines repeat and variation is minimal, their bodies seem to understand the rules immediately. Winter life made it obvious that young bodies adjusted faster than grown ones. Adults carried expectations from other places, other houses, other winters. Children arrived empty of comparison. What existed became normal simply because it was there. You notice how they choose their positions instinctively. Feet tucked in, hands near faces, heads angled toward warmth without instruction. They migrate during the night, inching closer to heat sources the way plants lean toward light. No one scolds them. Everyone understands why. There is a quiet relief in hearing a child sleep soundly underground. It confirms that the shelter is working. Restless children mean something is wrong. Cold floor, damp air ding, air too stale. Their sleep becomes a diagnostic tool whether you mean it to or not. A detail slips through several winter recollections. Parents often judge the night by how deeply children slept. If they slept through without waking, the shelter was holding. If they fussed or cried, adjustments were made immediately. Children reacted before adults felt trouble. You also notice how children wake. Not startled, not confused, They emerge slowly blinking, adjusting to the dimness without complaint. The underground morning does not shock them. It feels continuous, as if sleep simply softened into wakefulness. Some people later wondered whether children remembered these winters clearly. Many did not, or rather they remembered fragments. Warmth, voices, darkness without fear. The lack of sharp memories suggests how completely these nights were absorbed rather than endured. You pull a blanket higher around a small shoulder without waking anyone. The movement feels practiced, automatic. Underground life turns caretaking into instinct rather than task. Children also learn silence quickly here. Not imposed silence, practical silence. They sense how sound behaves and adjust their voices accordingly. Laughter becomes quieter, movement slows. The space teaches restraint without instruction. You think about how this environment shapes memory. No visual landmarks, few distinct nights. Winter blurs into a single extended experience. For children, that blur becomes background rather than trauma. Later retellings sometimes frame frontier childhood as unrelentingly harsh. That truth exists, but it sits alongside another one. Children found normalcy wherever they landed. Underground shelters for all their limits provided consistency. And consistency matters more to young minds than comfort. You lie back down, listening to the even breathing around you. The presence of children sleeping well eases something in your own chest. It confirms that tonight at least the balance holds. As sleep returns, you accept that adaptation is not always learned through effort. Sometimes it arrives naturally without resistance. Children show you this every night. Underground winter teaches quickly, and the youngest often learn first. Winter teaches habits quietly. You do not notice them forming until they are already part of how you move. A pause before standing, a glance toward the stove before settling, a hand testing air near the floor without conscious thought. These are not lessons written down. They settle into the body the way cold once did. You wake and adjust automatically. Blanket first, breath second, movement last, the order matters. Breaking it feels wrong now, even if you cannot explain why. Underground living rewires priority. Warmth comes before curiosity. Stability comes before speed. Over time, these habits stop feeling like strategies and start feeling like common sense. People living through long winters stop talking about them entirely. They simply did them. Anyone new learned by watching and copying, not by being told. You notice how often you check small things, the stove's posture, the feel of the wall near your shoulder, the floor beneath your feet. None of this rises to anxiety. It is awareness, the kind that keeps trouble small. Winter routines across the frontier grew this way. Not as strict rules, but as patterns reinforced by consequence. Forget to vent and air grows heavy. Rush outside and cold steals strength. Ignore dampness and misery follows. The environment corrected mistakes quickly and without mercy. A small habit shows itself in the way you arrange objects. Tools face the same direction every night. Clothing stays in reach. Nothing is placed where it would require fumbling in the dark. Order becomes warmth by another name. You notice that even your thinking has slowed, not dulled, measured. Underground nights stretch long enough to teach patience whether you want it or not. Impulse fades, reaction gives way to consideration. People who later returned to above-ground houses often carried these habits with them. They still noticed drafts others ignored. They still layered bedding long after winter ended. The shelter may have changed, but the instincts stayed close. You catch yourself listening before moving even when there is nothing to hear. That pause once belonged to caution. Now it belongs to rhythm. Underground life trains you to exist inside a steady tempo. There are evenings when you realize you have done everything right without thinking about it. Fire banked, bedding arranged, air balanced. That realization brings a quiet satisfaction, not pride, relief. Some observers looking back describe frontier survival as constant hardship. Those who lived it often remembered something else. The comfort of competence, knowing how to respond when conditions shifted. Habits removed uncertainty from nights that would otherwise feel endless. You settle into sleep more easily now. Your body trusts the routines it has built. It knows what comes next. It knows what to do if something changes. Even when you dream, these habits persist. You wake with hands already reaching for warmth, breath already slow. The underground has trained you thoroughly. As the night deepens, you realize that winter has done more than test you. It has shaped you. The habits it teaches do not fade with spring. They stay subtle and reliable long after the ground above you thaws. You close your eyes and let those habits carry you through another stretch of darkness. They're quiet now, nearly invisible, but they hold you steady all the same. You feel the change before you see it. The ground no longer holds its cold with the same certainty. There is a softness returning, subtle but unmistakable, like tension easing from a clenched hand. Winter has not ended, but it has begun to hesitate. Underground, this hesitation shows itself in small ways. The floor yields a little more underfoot. The air carries a different weight, neither fully dry nor heavy with damp. You notice moisture behaving differently now, appearing in places it did not before, retreating from others. The shelter responds, and so do you. You wake and sit up listening. The night no longer feels sealed. Somewhere above, snow has begun to settle rather than harden. Melt and refreeze trade places in slow cycles. This is the season that demands the most attention. Frozen ground was predictable. Softening ground asks questions. You check the walls with your palm, feeling for coolness for places that might darken faster than the rest. Nothing alarming yet. Just a reminder that stability is changing. You adjust bedding, slightly moving it away from spots that feel newly cool. These movements happen without urgency, guided by familiarity rather than fear. People who lived below ground learned to watch for these signs carefully. Winter was harsh, but it was consistent. The shift towards spring introduced uncertainty. Thaw could loosen what cold had locked in place. Those who paid attention early avoided trouble later. You notice how the smell of earth has changed. Less sharp, more alive. The soil is waking in its own way, even while cold nights continue. This scent carries information. It tells you when to open vents a little longer, when to dry bedding more thoroughly during the day. A habit appears now that was unnecessary deeper into winter. You begin checking the shelter more often during daylight, not out of worry but awareness. What held steady for months deserves re-evaluation when conditions shift. You listen for animals above. Their movements sound different too. Less stillness, more restlessness. Hooves break through crusted snow more often. Birds begin testing the air again. These signs register underground as faint changes in vibration and sound. Later reflections sometimes blur winter and spring together, but those living it felt the distinction clearly. The coldest nights were easier than these transitional ones. Soft ground required flexibility. Rigid habits loosened. Routines adjusted. You add a little less fuel to the stove at night now. Heat builds faster. Holding too much invites dampness. You respond by venting slightly more, letting fresh air circulate even when it steals a bit of warmth. Balance shifts and you shift with it. You lie down and feel the floor respond differently beneath you. Still supportive, still reliable, just more responsive. That responsiveness keeps you alert even as sleep comes. As you drift, you recognize this moment for what it is. Not an ending, a transition. Underground life has taught you how to listen for these changes without panic. Winter loosens its grip inch by inch. The ground beneath you prepares to change again. And you, shaped by months of careful attention, are ready to change with it. You step outside without ceremony. No announcement, no sense of arrival. The ground simply accepts your weight again, softer than it was weeks ago, no longer locked tight by cold. Winter has not left, but it has lost some authority. You feel that immediately. The air still bites, but it releases faster now. Cold no longer clings to skin with the same stubbornness. You breathe in and notice moisture in the air, a faint softness layered beneath the chill. That softness changes everything. You pause not because you're hesitant, but because habit tells you to observe first. You look across the land and see how unevenly the season retreats. Snow holds in shadow. Sunlight claims open patches. Paths reappear in familiar lines, then vanish again overnight. Nothing resolves cleanly. Underground life prepared you for this. You do not expect clarity. You expect fluctuation. You turn back towards the entrance behind you. From outside it still looks like winter's work. Earth packed high, snow pressed close. A shape meant to endure rather than impress. You feel a quiet appreciation for how little it asks of the landscape. It does not dominate, it waits. People who live this way rarely marked the end of winter with celebration. Records and recollections suggest something more cautious. The cold eased in stages, shelter routines softened without disappearing. Fires burned lower, vents opened longer, but nothing was abandoned all at once. You notice yourself doing the same. You do not strip layers immediately, you do not leave the door open. You keep routines close, letting them loosen only when conditions prove themselves repeatedly. The land looks tired rather than hostile now. Drifts slump instead of towering. Ice breaks instead of resisting. Even sound changes. Water begins to move again, somewhere beneath the snow, audible in quiet moments. You feel the urge to move more, stretch farther, stay outside longer. That urge is checked by memory. You've learned what impatience costs. Spring is generous, but only if approached slowly. You work outside for a time, aware of how different your body feels. Muscles warm faster. Fingers regain flexibility without pain. The contrast is noticeable. Underground nights preserved something in you. They did not drain you the way exposed nights would have. You glance back at the shelter again, not out of attachment but recognition. It did not trap you. It carried you. There is a difference. Some people left underground shelters as soon as the ground softened. Others stayed longer, finding no reason to rush. Comfort had recalibrated. Wind still felt loud. Open space still felt sharp. The earth offered continuity while everything else shifted. You step back inside briefly, not because you need to, but because the rhythm feels right. The space smells different now, less sharp, more awake. Light behaves differently too, reaching farther, staying longer. You sit and feel warmth gather quickly, faster than before. The shelter responds to change without complaint. That responsiveness reassures you. It means you have not overstayed. When you return outside again, you move with more confidence. Winter is no longer something you hide from. It is something you walk alongside as it withdraws. You do not declare the season over. You simply adapt the way you have learned to do underground. One adjustment at a time, one small decision layered over the last. As the day continues, you carry that patience with you. The earth taught it to you quietly night after night. Now even as you stand above ground again, that lesson holds. Winter loosens its grip. You do not celebrate. You proceed. You begin to notice something unexpected as days grow longer. The idea of leaving the dugout entirely does not feel urgent. You assumed it would. You imagined restlessness, a desire for height and openness. Instead, you feel a quiet reluctance, like setting aside a coat that still fits. The shelter has not become comfortable in the way a finished house might. It remains rough, dim and close, but it is familiar now. It responds the way you expect. Warmth gathers where it should. Air moves predictably. Nothing surprises you. After months of winter, predictability feels generous. Some people stayed underground far longer than necessity required. Not because they lacked resources, but because the arrangement worked. Earth did not demand repairs the way wood did. Wind did not pry at it. Fuel lasted longer. These practical advantages did not vanish just because snow began to retreat. You understand this now in your body. Above ground, even on mild days, you still brace without meaning to. You notice drafts instantly. You hear every sound. The openness feels loud. Down here, sound stays contained. Temperature shifts politely. The shelter keeps its promises. You move between worlds more easily now, but you linger underground longer than expected. You finish tasks outside, then return inside, not out of need, but preference. The ground still feels like the most stable part of your day. There are mentions in late frontier accounts of families who planned to move into cabins in spring but postponed year after year. Dugouts became permanent not by design but by success. The earth did not ask to be replaced. You run a hand along the wall, not checking for cold this time, but acknowledging familiarity. You know this surface. You know where it cools first, where it stays dry longest. These details have become part of you. You realize that leaving will require adjustment again. Open space demands different habits, fire behaves differently, sleep feels exposed. Even light can feel intrusive after months of dimness. Some people welcome that shift eagerly. Others found it uncomfortable, even unsettling. Memory smooths these reactions in hindsight, but living through the change made the contrast sharp. Shelter shapes expectation. When expectation changes, comfort follows slowly. You sit down and listen to the space. It is quieter now during the day as well. Birds above soften sound rather than breaking it. The ground still buffers everything. That buffering has become your baseline. You think about why some never left at all. Not because they feared the world above, but because they trusted what worked. Earth did not rot. It did not burn. It did not argue with weather. It simply endured. Eventually you will move on. You know that. But the lack of urgency surprises you. Underground life has recalibrated your sense of enough. Space matters less than steadiness. Height matters less than warmth. You lie down briefly even though it is daylight. The floor feels familiar beneath you. The air feels calm. You close your eyes and realize you are resting, not hiding. When you rise again, you do so without rush. The shelter will still be here tomorrow. And for now, that certainty feels like a gift winter gave you without asking. Stories about frontier life tend to sharpen with time. Edges grow harder. Cold becomes crueler. Nights stretch longer than they ever truly did. You notice this when people talk about winter later, speaking as if endurance itself was the goal. Living it felt different. It was not about proving anything. It was about arranging life so that it continued. Underground shelters suffer especially in retellings. They are described as desperate, miserable, barely survivable. Yet your memory resists that framing. You remember difficulty, yes, but you also remember steadiness. The dugout did not fight winter. It negotiated with it. You think about how often people imagine frontier nights as sleepless vigils. In truth, exhaustion usually won. After days of physical work and careful adjustment, sleep arrived whether conditions were ideal or not. Underground, that sleep was often deeper than expected. The earth muted interruption. Darkness simplified the night. You recall moments that contradict the harsher legends. Quiet laughter. Warmth pooling where it should. The satisfaction of a shelter holding through a storm you barely noticed. These details rarely survive dramatic storytelling. They're too subtle, too ordinary. Even the idea that underground living was universally temporary begins to feel questionable. Many stayed longer than planned because nothing forced them out. The shelter did its job, wind and cold lost their leverage, convenience replaced aspiration. You notice how myths favour extremes, either heroic cabins standing against blizzards or suffering families trapped below ground. Reality sat somewhere between. Dugouts were not romantic, but they were effective. They required attention, not heroics. You remember how the darkness felt not frightening but consistent, how sound softened, how the floor held warmth. These experiences do not fit neatly into tales of hardship. They suggest adaptation rather than struggle. Later accounts often exaggerate isolation, imagining underground life as lonely and bleak. Your memory includes proximity, shared breath, the comfort of knowing someone else was nearby awake or asleep. Winter compressed life inward. It did not erase connection. You also think about how survival stories love a clear endpoint. The moment winter breaks, the triumphant emergence. But winter rarely ended that way. It loosened gradually. People adjusted gradually. There was no dramatic exit scene from the dugout, just fewer reasons to stay. These myths persist because they simplify, they make sense of the past by turning it into a test passed or failed. Living it felt more fluid. Choices shifted with weather resources and energy. No single narrative covered every winter or every family. You consider how memory edits discomfort. Pain sharpens. Quiet successes fade. The nights that passed without incident leave little trace. Yet those nights made up most of winter. They were the reason people endured at all. Underground shelters rarely appear in paintings or monuments. They are hard to romanticize visually. From above they almost disappear. That invisibility mirrors how they functioned. They did not announce themselves. They simply worked. You realize that many myths come from those who only experienced dugouts briefly or heard about them secondhand. Long-term residents describe something more balanced. A life reduced to essentials: warmth, air, light, rest. As you reflect, you feel a gentle correction taking place. The story you carry forward will not be one of misery alone. It will include competence, learning, adjustment, the quiet relief of a roof that does not complain. You stand and look once more at the space around you. It is plain. It always was. But plain does not mean inadequate. It means focused. You understand now that frontier hardship was real, but so was frontier ingenuity. Underground living was not a failure of ambition. It was a solution shaped by environment. When you step away from these nights in memory, you carry something more useful than drama. You carry an understanding of how people lived with winter rather than against it. That understanding feels closer to the truth than any legend ever could. You notice what is missing before you notice what remains. There are no precise descriptions of nights like these in most records. Pages list weather, livestock counts, seed orders, debts. They rarely linger on how it felt to lie still while the earth held winter at bay. That absence becomes noticeable only after you have lived it. You think back through what was written down and what was not. Dinevs often jump from evening tasks straight to morning work, skipping the long hours in between. As if sleep itself needed no explanation, as if the night simply passed on its own. Underground, you understand why. Nights that function properly leave little to say. You try to remember specific moments. Individual nights blur together. Not because they were forgettable, but because they were consistent. Consistency resists storytelling. Drama needs contrast. Stability does not provide it. This is why so much underground life survives only in fragments. A mention of frost inside, complaint about damp walls, a passing note about a stove behaving badly. Rarely does anyone pause to describe the feeling of being held by soil while wind scoured the surface above. That sensation does not fit neatly into ledgers or letters. You realize that what people wrote down tended to be what broke routine. Illness, shortages, damage. When everything worked, there was nothing to report. The shelter did its job. Sleep happened. Morning arrived. Ink was saved for things that demanded response. A small, easily overlooked habit appears in a few scattered notes. People sometimes apologize for not writing more often during winter, citing fatigue or short days. They rarely mentioned where that fatigue came from. Nights underground required less vigilance than nights above, but they still consumed energy in subtler ways. Attention itself tired the body. You think about how memory works. The mind smooths repetition into background. Only disruptions stand out. That smoothing process erases most underground nights from personal history, even though they made survival possible. Later retellings filled in those gaps with assumption. Darkness became fear, silence became loneliness, closeness became discomfort. You recognize now how easily those assumptions form when lived experience is missing. You remember the quiet competence of these nights, the way your body learned where to lie, how breath slowed without instruction, how the ground's steadiness seeped into thought. None of that announces itself. It leaves no sharp edge for memory to grab. You imagine someone trying to describe this life to an audience that has never known it. How do you explain a night that does exactly what it should, that neither harms nor thrills, that simply allows life to continue? You begin to see why underground shelters disappear from history in this way. They did not produce stories, they produced mornings. The absence itself becomes meaningful. It tells you that survival often looks like nothing happening. No emergency, no triumph, just rest sufficient to face the next day. You lie back and let this realization settle. The earth does not ask to be remembered. It does its work quietly and moves on. People did the same. As sleep approaches again, you accept that much of what mattered about these winters was never recorded, and never will be. It lived in muscles, in breath, in habits carried forward without explanation. Those unwritten nights shaped lives just as surely as any event that made it onto a page. And now, resting here, you feel yourself becoming part of that quiet record, one more person carried through winter without leaving much behind to describe it. You realize it in small moments first, a pause before acting, a preference for stillness over speed. These are not habits you consciously chose. They followed you out of the ground the way the smell of earth followed your clothes, faint but persistent. You notice it when you enter other spaces. A room feels drafty, even when others seem comfortable. You look for corners where warmth gathers. You arrange yourself closer to walls without thinking. Underground instincts surface quietly, shaping how you exist long after you no longer need them. You sleep differently now too, even above ground, but view listens for changes in temperature, for shifts in air that might wake you. You wake briefly at night, orient yourself, then settle again without alarm. This light vigilance feels normal. Comfort no longer means unconsciousness. It means readiness without tension. People who lived underground for seasons often carried these instincts forward. Letters written years later mentioned in habits that puzzle neighbours. Extra blankets kept close in summer. Fires banked longer than necessary. Doors opened and closed with care. The earth had taught caution, and caution stayed. You notice how your sense of enough has changed. Space matters less. Quiet matters more. You're less interested in openness for its own sake. You have learned that safety can come from closeness, from structures that hold rather than display. You think about how these instincts would have passed unnoticed. No one would have named them as lessons. They simply became part of behaviour folded into daily life. Underground winterers shaped people in ways that did not announce themselves. You catch yourself listening before sitting scanning for drafts that are not there, choosing spots where warmth feels steadier. These movements do not slow you down, they ground you. Memory smooths the harsher edges of winter now. What remains are these internal adjustments, the ability to wait, the habit of conserving energy, the trust in simple systems that work quietly without praise. You realize that the underground did more than shelter your body. It trained your attention. It taught you to notice small changes before they became problems. That skill carries forward into everything else. You rest more easily now because you know how to make rest happen. You understand what interferes with it and what protects it. Noise, draft, sudden change. You manage these without effort. As you lie back, reflecting, you feel gratitude not for comfort but for competence. The earth taught you how to live through long nights without drama. That knowledge feels portable. It goes with you wherever you sleep. You breathe slowly and let the thought pass. There is no need to hold on to it tightly. These instincts are already part of you. They surface when needed and stay quiet when not. The underground is behind you now, but its influence remains, not as memory but as behaviour, not as story but as instinct. And as the night deepens, wherever you are now, you find yourself resting with the same measured calm, guided by lessons learned in the dark, held close, doing their work without asking to be noticed. Letting the earth go does not happen all at once. You do not wake one morning and decide the shelter has finished its work. Instead, the relationship loosens gradually the way winter itself did. You spend fewer hours inside, you leave the door open longer, you stop checking the walls with your palm every time you pass. One day you realize you slept above ground without thinking about it, not because you meant to, but because conditions allowed it. The night was mild, the wind behaved. You woke rested anyway. That realization lands softly without celebration. You return underground out of habit more than need. The space greets you the same way it always has. Calm, dim, reliable. But something has shifted. You no longer require what it offers. Appreciation replaces dependence. You sit for a while, breathing in the familiar scent of soil and smoke. The shelter feels smaller now, not because it changed, but because you have. Months of winter narrowed your world to essentials. Now space is expanding again. People who lived this way often spoke of leaving underground shelters with mixed feelings. Relief, yes, but also a strange hesitation. Earth had been honest, predictable. Above ground, weather returned with its noise and unpredictability. That contrast could feel jarring. You take a final look around, not searching for flaws, but acknowledging the work done here. Nights passed without disaster. Storms softened, heat held, sleep came often enough, that is success by any practical measure. You touch the wall once more, feeling its cool steadiness. It does not respond. It never did. The earth was never sentimental about sheltering you. It simply allowed it. As you step away, you carry lessons, rather than longing. You know where warmth gathers. You know how little space a person truly needs to rest. You know that silence can be protective and darkness does not have to be feared. These lessons do not fade when daylight returns. They stay with you, shaping choices quietly. How you arrange a room, how you prepare for night, how you respond to discomfort before it grows teeth. You close the door gently, not sealing it forever, just setting a boundary. The shelter remains, someone else may use it. Or it may return to earth slowly, grass reclaiming its shape, snow smoothing what remains. Either way feels appropriate. You step into open air and feel how different it is now. Not hostile, just wide. You move through it with patience, learned underground, no longer rushing, no longer bracing unnecessarily. The earth did not keep you hidden. It kept you steady. That distinction matters. As you walk away, you realize that sleeping below ground was never about retreat. It was about choosing a relationship with winter that prioritized endurance over resistance. The earth offered that option quietly. You accepted it, and now you release it just as quietly. The ground stays where it is, winter moves on, and you carry forward what you learned, settling into rest wherever you are, knowing that steadiness can be built even in the coldest nights. The story does not end sharply. It eases the way your breathing eases when you realize there is nothing left to manage tonight. You're no longer listening for the stove. You're no longer testing the air or counting layers. Those instincts relax their grip one by one, as if they understand their work is finished for now. You picture the earth settling back into itself after you leave soil, holding the memory of warmth for a while before letting it fade. Nothing dramatic happens. Grass will grow, snow will fall again someday. The ground does not keep score, it simply continues. Your body remembers this rhythm even as you lie somewhere else now, somewhere safer, warmer, quieter in a different way. You notice how your shoulders sink into whatever supports you, how your jaw loosens, how the space around you feels steady enough to stop paying attention to. The long winter nights underground taught you something gentle, that rest does not require perfection, that safety can come from stillness, that silence can be a companion rather than a threat. Those lessons do not need repeating. They are already part of how you settle into sleep. Thoughts slow, they stretch out, losing their sharp edge. Images soften. Earth, warmth, dim light, a sense of being held without effort. You do not need to follow these images anywhere. Let them pass like clouds that do not demand names. Your breathing finds a deeper rhythm now, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Each breath a little slower than the last. Nothing presses, nothing asks. If your mind wanders, let it. If it goes quiet, let that happen too. There is no right way to rest here. Just the gradual release of attention. The ground once carried you through winter. Tonight, whatever supports you now carries you just as well. You're allowed to stop watching, allowed to stop listening. So settle in. Let this night stretch gently around you. Let sleep arrive when it is ready, unhurried, calm, complete. Sweet dreams. Sips your skims.